Recording in progress, so maybe I should then. Like,
oh yes, you have to
do something with this.
No, up there. Up.
It's the same. Yep. Okay. Right. So thanks everyone for joining today, and especially to our colleagues coming from Berlin, and we have I'm thrilled to have everyone here. Yeah, I didn't prepare. Usually I'm writing something, but I totally forgot because we had so much going on. But Anastasia and Philipp are going to present an overview talk of some of the stuff that we've done within the VW project. And again, I want to say thank you all for coming and for what we had in the last few days. And yeah, over to you, Philipp and Anastasia.
Thank you. Thanks, Almog. I will go first, and then Anastasia. And if time is left, I come back again. So hello, everyone online. I think I'll stay like that. You see the slides. And for some of you, this talk might be familiar, especially people who are part of this project. And I see there are several external visitors and people who might be surprised by those things, and that's good to know. First of all, a little bit of context. Reclaiming individual autonomy and democratic discourse online is the title of this talk, but it's also the title of the project we're running together with Steve and our colleagues in Boston. And yeah, the people from Berlin are at the Center for Adaptive Rationality at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, so that you know. You can visit our website. The link is on the bottom. And you will find some more information on the project. It's a rather bigger project, 4 years, and we already produced some results, and you'll find the papers there. So check it out if you like. And today we want to give an overview, but actually we will have a deep dive into at least 3 of the studies, because I think it's more interesting to look at some specific results instead of overwhelming you with all the many papers that have been written. But yeah, we'll try to give an overview. So I'll just get into it. First of all, we did build a conceptual foundation for this project, and in case you have not come across those papers, advertise them a bit. This is the first one is from Anastasia and Steve and Ralph. It's a very extensive overview of the challenges, the cognitive challenges that people face in the online world, and yeah, make suggestions of how to overcome them. Just as a brief overview, there are the choice architectures that can be manipulative, especially online. There is AI that's running in the background and creates the information architecture. There's false and misleading information, and generally the attention capturing environments that are all challenges that are specifically interesting or pronounced in the online world. And this is a nice overview on how to then tackle them. So please check it out. There's another conceptual or perspective overview. This is a bit more focusing on the actual user interface, so to say. This is written by myself and colleagues that are very well represented here. And we make more specific suggestions of how the user interface could be improved. And this is then using the framework of nudging, but also especially boosting interventions that are trying to create competences and help the users interact with those interfaces. Overall, this is a guiding principle of the project, the boosting approach. So there's a website beyond our project, even more generally summarizing the science of boosting. I also invited to look at that. The digital boosting interventions are just one category of many more. And it's a general approach which should go alongside or alternative sometimes to the nudging approach, because the goal of those interventions is not to steer behavior, but to foster competences as a more educative approach. And there's the main paper cited on the bottom on that. But I want to present a bit more in depth one paper that we just recently published, but I think we should have done it actually quite early in the process, because it's actually somehow a foundational work to all the follow-up things we are doing, because it's very on the high level concerned with the relationship between democratic processes and digital media. I'm sure you know this graph. This is the VDEM data set over time and for these 4 continents. And you see some dynamic behavior here, and what is probably causing the discussion about the backsliding of democracy in the current public discussion, but also in some of the scientific discussion, is this kind of dip that started 10 years ago, and in some countries going down, these indices. So that was also interesting for us. And, you know, we shouldn't, just because social media came around at similar times, here confuse correlation with causation. So we wanted to do it properly and at least check what the science has to say. So what is the knowledge that we have so far about this relationship between digital media and those indices or generally democratic indicators. So this is the paper. It has been, it's also with Stephen Ralph, and I want to emphasize it's also with Lisa Oswald, who is equal contributing first author with me, and did a very great job in this project. And it's a systematic review. So our approach was to really comb through the literature and see what's there. The methodology is not that exciting. Systematic reviews, you design a search query for Web of Science or Scopus. We had a rather complex search query. So there's the type of media on the left. We try to throw a very wide net and capture everything that's there. So we included social media, online media, digital media, and then also the specific platforms. We had different outcome measures that we looked at, but they're all somehow political behavior. So voting behavior or polarization, conspiracy beliefs, radicalization, as well as content features, we call them, which is something like misinformation or echo chambers, so properties of the media themselves. And then we wanted to be rather strict on the methodology and just look at empirical papers that really report empirical evidence, and wanted to have a specific strong focus on papers that aim to report causal relationships. So we included all those in the query. This gave us 3,500 papers as a raw output. But of course, there's a lot of things in there that you don't want to consider. Polarization especially is also a phenomenon in physics, in case you know. And so we got quite some papers on that. So just screening the titles, we got rid of 2,000 papers. We went into the abstracts, and if it's not empirical work, we had a lot of theoretical work in this sample, of course, people theorizing about social media and its effects. We also excluded all of those. And then we also looked at some quality criteria. In the end, we ended up with almost 500 articles that met our criteria. You can get the full table on this link. You can also find it on the paper. It's linked on the bottom. And you can actually sort those papers by outcome measures. So if you're interested specifically in polarization or something like that, you can actually pick out this subgroup and have a look. And of course, we couldn't do justice to all those papers. Each paper is a story in itself, as you know. And we had to aggregate the results in a very crude manner. These are many papers, and we had to take a bird's eye view on those. So I think there's a lot to explore still in this data set, and it's like annotated with the country in the research was, so the sample is coming from, yeah, the outcome measure, as I said, I think the method, if it's a survey or longitudinal or descriptive, and so on. So yeah, explore it yourself if you want. And just a few stats on the sample. Over the years, this is a rising number. That's the documents that Web of Science puts out to our query. This dip in the end is not a real dip. This is just because it was in early 2022 that I ran this. So we have a, I don't know, rather exponential increase of those papers. Of course, this is due to that digital media is a new phenomenon, and it started to pick up research interest. It might also be something to do with these democracy indices that I showed before, so that the research community becomes really concerned and interested in this topic. We were slightly pleasantly surprised by the global coverage of the papers. I mean, of course, you have a very strong US bias here. It's the big majority, and that's a logarithmic color scale, so it's really a lot in the US. Otherwise, it would look very boring, this map, you wouldn't see much. So, but still, there is some coverage across the world. There's way too little in Africa. So in case you have the possibility to do research there on this topic, I think there's a good opportunity to do so. South Asia is also, there are some studies around there, but you know, it's of course not comparable to the focus in the US. And as I said, we threw a wide net, and we had this challenge to, in some way, make sense of this data. Of course, it is easier if you focus on one outcome measure, because then, I don't know, you can compare the effects and so on. And in our case, we wanted to look at all those different outcome measures. And so we had to do some crude choices and categorizations. And here you see, please don't, political scientists don't be angry here, but we we separated the outcome variables into two categories, either to be beneficial for liberal democracies or detrimental. What I mean with that is, you see on the left a general trust in institutions and media we considered as beneficial, even though we can discuss that there's a healthy level of trust, and maybe at some point it's an unhealthy level of trust in your institutions, but we decided for that to be beneficial. Participation, so political participation is considered to be beneficial for liberal democracy. Political knowledge is beneficial, the exposure to diverse news, and the possibility to express your political views. On the other side, the detrimental side, maybe more obvious or similarly obvious than some others. On the other side is, for example, hate speech. So the prevalence of hate speech is not a good sign for democratic discourse. Polarization to a certain extent. You see, for example, here, there are whole papers about all the facets of polarization. We summed them up into this term. Again, you can go into the table, for example, and differentiate between issue polarization and effective polarization and all the variants of it. But in this case, we summarized them and we said polarization is in this detrimental. In the most extreme cases, I think people would agree. The populism, so this can be the success of populist parties or the prevalence of populist content, and the prevalence of misinformation, as well as the presence of homophilous network structures. We coded as detrimental for liberal democracies. And there's something in the chat.
Yeah, Fabio just pointed out something about the link.
Oh yeah.
So he was the link.
Oh, but it's an error. And that's the right link. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks, Fabio. Then there was a typo in my slides, probably. Okay. Then I'll get to the results. So here, those are the number of papers not the number of papers, because in one paper you can have several measurements. Sometimes one paper measures two outcome variables, so you might have a few more measurements than papers, but roughly similar numbers. And those are the distributions of their really very crude outcome. Okay, just if it's a negative, a positive, or no association reported in that study. And you see on the left, we start with the good things. I think this is rather established finding by now that political participation is positively associated with the use of digital media. This was by far the clearest result in our sample. There are other reviews reporting that, so that's not really new. Still, I think it's a very interesting finding, and I don't think the mechanisms are understood yet. So why is it mobilizing more than maybe other media? And we also saw that political knowledge is rather positive, associated positively, is like in many papers, but not in all. And there are substantial heterogeneities on those effects. So it can be very beneficial to your knowledge, or there can be a positive association to political knowledge, but it is often moderated by their education levels. And you see it's a bit less clear than the participation results. The diversity exposure, for example, is rather found to be positively associated, which is feeding into the echo chamber discussion, or actually the debunking of the echo chamber idea. However, I think we have here an interesting finding, because news diversity might be higher on digital media, but if you look at the homophilic network structures on the right, you find somehow the opposite. So I think there are two types of definitions of what is an echo chamber: a social echo chamber or a news echo chamber, where one is supported and the other is not so much. Also, political expression seems to be good, but one finding we found rather surprising was the trust in institutions. I think people are getting very aware of this now. It's really becoming part of the discussion that people seem to lose trust in political institutions. As I said, this can be healthy, but in many systems, this is not healthy, especially when we consider the system to function. And that's, I think, a finding that I find personally most interesting, because it could be something that is at the bottom of things. I think this could also have some downstream consequences, for example, such as the success of populism on digital media, because you see on the right that it's also been found that often populism have relatively higher success or prevalence on digital media. And, you know, trust and populism, I think, have some things in common. Or at least populism can feed on a loss in trust. Polarization is something that is quite well known and discussed. Hate speech is prevalent, and the network structures I've been talking about, as well as misinformation, has been found in these papers to be present on digital media. One more interesting detail to these findings is that those are not equally distributed across the globe. So what we, and I have more, this is not the easiest graph to read, but the finding is that we have the positive outcomes here in green are really more concentrated in emerging democracies, or more in the global south, so in South America and Africa, while the mixed results and also the detrimental results are more prevalent in established democracies like the EU and the US. The autocracies, or those systems like in Russia and China, it's a bit difficult to say. There are kind of diverging results. So on one hand, you find this liberating aspect of digital media, where journalists use it in order to prevent the state-controlled television or so. But you also see problematic outcomes like increased hate crimes when it's about the state-controlled digital platforms like Weibo or VKontakte. So, but there are very few studies out of those countries, and it's very difficult to interpret their results because you even feel from the writing sometimes that they are trying to hide what they found and not really fully can publish their results. However, you can now still say, this is all correlational evidence. Why should we care? And that's why we had a specific focus on causal evidence. So we picked out the few papers that used causal inference methods in all their variety. And these were only 22 papers after all from these 500. So there's quite little causal evidence. So also here, I think there's a lot of work to be done. This is a mix of kind of natural experiments. So there's some kind of circumstance that happened because there's a school class from Taiwan moving to the US and then using different digital media, and you compare their attitudes, or there's a temporal and local variation of this variable we are interested in, like the broadband internet connection, and then you can estimate if there are causal directions in the effect on, for example, hate crimes or political attitudes. I think some of them are well known. You see the Bale field experiment or Alcott. So we've listed them here. Overall, the summary on those would be that the general pattern seems to be overlapping with the correlational evidence we found. It's, of course, with 22 studies, not that clear, but you see that polarization and hate thing goes in the same direction, as well as trust and knowledge. We also have similar directions, and the participation also seems to be confirmed. But as I said, each of those studies is a story in itself and has a lot of detail. So my conclusion on that study, because then we can move on to Anastasia, is our conclusion is it's complicated, like always. So there seems to be that digital media have some specific directions of how they change or impact political behavior. It's not that we found very many null effects, and we don't have real reason or proper reason to assume that this is a file drawer problem. And in that sense, we think that social media does have a specific direction, for example, this mobilization direction or the trust part. And I think these connections are still not really well understood. But we also should acknowledge that this this is a phenomenon that happens globally and happened very quickly globally around the world, and that the effects can be very different and strongly depend seemingly on the political system there. So again, like in many technologies, also digital media are powerful, and depending on who is using them, they can be either used for good and bad. And I think this is really something we need to understand better still. So it's probably not that simple story, either bad or good, like many might have hoped. And since it seems that we have to discuss about the values and the types of things that digital media foster and not foster, Anastasia will now show some results on what people would think where the direction should be. And I'm switching to this.
Yes, thanks so much. It's hard to follow this, but I will tell you today about two of our studies, which are basically, like, you can be subsumed under the umbrella of studying public attitudes to different aspects of digital challenges and algorithmic challenges specifically. So to introduce the issue, I would like to again talk about this concept of AI-assisted information architectures that Philipp mentioned, and talking about the citizens versus the internet paper, right? This concept that I think actually Steve coined described this use of algorithmic tools and AI-assisted tools in order to curate information in online environments. You know, the information online is a stream of data. There is a lot of it. There is no way this can exist without some filtering processes that filter it to present to users in a certain way. So for example, algorithmic curation and personalization takes the information in social news feeds or in search engines and filter it so that it fits people's interests, or it fits people's interests for advertising, for instance. There are bots and smart assistants, especially now. This paper was, of course, written before ChatGPT, but I think ChatGPT is now a big topic in this, also sort of AI-assisted tools that we use online. And then there are other algorithmic tools that, for example, are used to moderate content on social networks. So if a user posts contradict content moderation policies, this is algorithmic tools that moderate this information. Okay, so that's like the basic concept that we're interested in here, right? And then, and again, I don't want to overemphasize the bad things about it. I think in general, it's a positive thing. It's a necessary thing. There is no way online environment can exist without filtering algorithms. It's just not possible, right? They make it more efficient and more relevant to people. But then, as we've talked about also, as Philipp also talked about, there are potential problems and risks that can be associated with the use of these architectures online. And one of them is that recommender system can promote engaging content because that's in the platform interest, but sometimes it can happen at the expense of quality or even accuracy. That political targeting can amplify polarization or maybe even dilute shared perception of reality. That collection of personal data that is absolutely necessary for these algorithms to function, okay, absolutely necessary is also a questionable expression here. That is usually collected in order to design, to fit into these algorithms, can endanger people's privacy. That content removal that these algorithmic content moderation tools are performing can endanger freedom of expression. But at the same time, allowing this content to remain on the platform can pose other societal risks. So that's just a very broad strokes picture of what can possibly go wrong, but also attract our research interest. And that also highlights that, these tools, they cannot possibly be designed or function without some sort of rules and guidelines behind them. So for example, when we're talking about algorithmic content moderation, there are platforms, policies, and community guidelines that underpin this content moderation decision. Algorithms don't make these decisions by themselves. And we're talking about personalized choice environments. There is not one set of rules and guidelines for this, but there are different kind of guidelines around, for instance, use of personal data or around targeting advertisement that also regulate what kind of data is collected, what is targeted to people. And then the topic I find interesting in the current context, there's this exploding field of generative AI, such as ChatGPT, as we all know, right? There are also rules and guidelines that these tools use that govern behavior and responses of this program, so that they are, for instance, programmed if a user wants to see some information that can be harmful or misleading, these tools have guidelines to, for instance, to direct user to the information that is accurate, or to even not display information that can be harmful. And somebody designs these rules, right? Obviously, there is usually teams at these institutions that decide how these tools should function, right? And I think it's very important to get these rules right, because all these algorithmic systems, they affect a lot of things that are fundamental to democracies, but also to people's rights, such as right to privacy or right to freedom of expression. And here I would argue that public attitudes are also important to know when it comes to how these rules and guidelines should be designed. I would, of course, say, yes, this is not the only benchmark. There are other streams of thinking and research that should fit into how we design the rules. But I would also say it's not acceptable as a benchmark to just allow these rules to be designed in private companies alone. So this is where our modest attempt comes into play in these two projects to study public attitudes to first. I'm going to talk about algorithmic personalization and then to content moderation. So in this project, which we ran still in the planning stage of the grant, not in the full grant, we collected data in a survey format from people in Germany, Great Britain, and the United States on their attitudes to privacy online, or their awareness of existence of these tools, and specifically on what I will talk today on personalization, on algorithmic personalization. And so yeah, in this part of the survey, we asked them about their attitudes to three components of personalization, which we distinguish as first services, and then information and data. I'll explain what each of them means. I'll start with services, right? So the question was, how acceptable do you think it is for social media to collect and use data about you and your past activities to personalize different services? And they have to indicate how acceptable it is for these different services. And these are the results for this part, right? So what we see that people are much more accepting for personalization of things that are entertaining or useful to them in some way. Yeah? So recommending restaurants and shops, recommending music and movie, all these things they find quite acceptable, probably unsurprisingly. What is interesting here, that we see that there is an opposition to personalization, for instance, of political campaign messages, right? So people think, especially in Germany and Great Britain, and a bit more divided in the US sample, that it is important that sort of political reporting still exists in this common space. So we all have a shared political reality, and not that messages are personalized to us based on our preferences, let's say. And also online newspapers, more division here, and in the US actually goes in a different direction, but in European countries, there is also opposition to this kind of. And we also see the differences between the countries, right? So of course, Germany is always on the more extreme side of not finding things acceptable when it comes to personalization, and the US finding things much more acceptable, and UK, well, as you would expect, probably in between. Yeah, so that's this first part of this three types of three key components of personalization. Two other are information, that is, and data. And this is sometimes difficult to distinguish, but basically when we're talking about information, we're talking about how acceptable it is for platforms to use following information. It's not talking about how it's collected, and more that, is it okay to use your political views, however they were inferred, or your sexual orientation, to personalize advertising to you? When we're talking about data, it's more about like really collecting the information from you when you use the services, such as browsing and search history, location history, online messages, and so on. So then we move to this, to results for this question. I think it's like a bit of a different pattern emerges, so that we see in both information and data that people find it really quite unacceptable to use both information or to collect data for personalization purposes. Again, variation between countries, and only age and gender, for example, are considered fair game. Yeah, okay, you can use my age and gender to personalize services, but the more sensitive the information we are talking about, or the more sensitive the data, the less acceptable people find it. And what we also found quite curious, sort of comparing to the previous results for services, that of course services, people find personalization of services more acceptable than use of information or collection of data for the purposes of personalization. So we thought it was an interesting kind of contrast in itself, and we coined this term, the acceptability gap, a little bit like privacy paradox, right? So on the one hand, people do see advantages in the fact that services are personalized to their needs, to their interests. But the fact that this personalization possible because there is personal data and personal information used for this that somehow is different. So, and that's one possible explanation. So we don't know how to exactly explain this based on this data. It's impossible, right? But two potential explanations we have. One is that there is a trade-off that people decide on. They decide between, okay, I get some value from services being personalized to me, and maybe at this point I do give up some of the other things that I find unacceptable. So a trade-off. That's one possibility, which we cannot, of course, know from this. And another possibility is that there might, for which there is some evidence in other people's research, that people might be generally unaware that all this information and data are actually used for services to be personalized to them. So the level of awareness to which kind of sensitive data might be inferred or used is potentially low, so that the gap emerges because the information environment does not provide them with sufficient information to then actually make an informed choice. So that's, and I don't have a slide for this, but I'll mention this sort of in highlights. Yeah, so first, I mean, one of the takeaway from this is that the public perceives clear ethical boundaries in the use of algorithmic personalization online. People in the survey countries, they object to collection of use of sensitive personal information and personalization of political campaigning, and in Germany and Great Britain to the personalization of news sources. And that, importantly, I didn't have a slide for this, but I tell you this now, that these attitudes, as well as privacy attitudes, are independent of political preferences in the country. So this is not a polarized issue as such. So people across the political spectrum have very similar concerns about their data privacy or about their attitudes to personalized services. So that's one study about people's attitudes. Another one is our most recent project, which is still ongoing in the sense that we want to take it further. And probably one of my favorite studies is the one about how do people approach content moderation dilemmas. The content moderation, which is done algorithmically. We didn't address the algorithmic part in this particular project, but more how do, and I'll tell you about more what was the actual problem we wanted to focus on. And that's the paper about resolving content moderation dilemma between free speech and harmful misinformation, which already tells you what was our focus, right? And to preview the study design and the results, basically want to tell you that this sort of trade-off between we are the platform, we have the community guidelines and the rules, but we all people who work at these platforms, they all constantly have to make decisions. What is more important to them? Do they want to prioritize freedom of expression and then allow most of the content to exist on the platform, or do they want to be more cautious and maybe sort of introduce guidelines that prevent harmful information from spreading, thus maybe controlling the speech much more? And this is not a stable preference when it comes to platforms governance of online speech. So, for instance, from the very beginning, it was quite an often refrain that Mark Zuckerberg and people like him in the Silicon Valley, they would say, of course, they stand for voice for freedom of expression. And that's, of course, not the only example, but maybe a telling one. But then there was a notable shift. It occurred, then the pandemic started mostly, and then also sort of coincided with this growing concerns about potential threats to democracy related to digital media. So as Evelyn Dweck, a legal scholar who works in content moderation, calls it, in 2020, it was the year that changed the internet, basically pushing platforms like Facebook and Twitter in the position they never wanted to have, to be the arbiters of truth. Most platforms in 2022 and then 2021 introduced strict guidelines prohibiting misinformation about COVID. Then, of course, this event happened, and Donald Trump was suspended from most platforms for spreading false information and inciting violence. So that was, I would say, like the very interesting development in this free speech versus controlling harms debate. But then another shift has happened more recently, right? And the Elon Musk emerged as a new CEO of Twitter, and yeah, yet again sort of came back to this previous narrative, right? Like that he is championing free speech, that free speech is essential to function in democracy. He reinstated Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump didn't return to Twitter, but nevertheless, he was reinstated. Many other accounts that were suspended were reinstated again. And well, you know all, I'm sure, the story about this. But what is interesting, I find, in this whole debate is that there is this underlying conflict between two values, right? On the one hand, we have the value of free speech that nobody here would deny is indeed important and a bedrock of functioning democracy. It doesn't matter what we feel about Elon Musk. In essence, he's right? Like freedom of expression is a fundamental right that deserves protection. Nobody wants to live in autocratic countries. But on the other hand, there's all these other voices that also raise important concerns, saying, well, this kind of approach to free speech, which is called free speech absolutism, doesn't take into account very real harms that uncontrolled speech online can cause to people and to societies. And that is sort of another side of this debate, right? On the one hand, everybody agrees freedom of speech is important, but we also agree that we don't want harmful misinformation or harmful content in general to exist. And what do we do? Like at a certain situation, we face this dilemma, right? Like we want to prevent harms. We remove the harmful information, but thereby we endanger freedom of expression through potential censorship, although I don't like this term in this context. But if we leave harmful misinformation, we might create risks for society and even to people's lives. And both of these outcomes are bad, because in reality, what we want to that both values or both outcomes kind of exist simultaneously. We simultaneously want freedom of expression and harmful misinformation are prevented, but that's not possible in this situation. And that's why I would argue that we are facing what is called a moral dilemma, where we want to adopt both alternatives, both values, but actually we cannot do it simultaneously. And that's the concept we wanted to implement in the design of our study, right? And our study was based on designing these 4 scenarios where people had to, okay, maybe it's actually a better slide is this one, where in the study task, they had to face a scenario detailing what happened, right? Like the harmful misinformation is spreading on the platform, but since it was a conjoined design, we were interested in how all these different attributes of harmful content would affect people's decision to remove the posts or to leave them on, or to what to do with the user account. And we focused on 4 misinformation topics: the election denial, sort of following what happened to Trump, COVID anti-vaccination, Holocaust denial, and climate change denial. And we selected these topics based on actual platform policies. So obviously we always get the question of why your scenarios are not balanced in terms of beliefs, because of course, except for Holocaust denial, these are all, and also I would argue election denial because of the design, of the conjoined design, both COVID anti-vaccination and climate change denial, right-wing, sort of Republican-leaning respondents, of course, are more likely to believe this. But there was a trade-off, and that's what we decided. We decided it's more interesting to go with actual platform policies, the actual dilemmas that the platform policies face, and that was the study task, right? So you see the post, you see what potential, not in this case, not even potential. You see the consequences, what follow. Was it repeated offense or first time sharing of misinformation? And what was the account number of followers, and what kind of misinformation it shared? So briefly, the results, I'll only show two parts of the result, or the most important ones. First is just going into content moderation preferences and seeing on aggregate, on average, what were people's decision to remove the posts and to penalize the accounts. So as you see here, let's start with the panel A at the top left corner. So we see here that the majority of people on average, on aggregate level, prefer to remove harmful misinformation on all of these topics, with climate change denial being restricted to the list, and with Holocaust denial being removed the most. If we go to the panel B, then when we see that, of course, it's the decision made were very different depending on people's partisanship. The Democrats overwhelmingly chose to remove the posts, and Republicans were actually on the fence. So it's not like that Republicans had an opposite pattern to Democrats, but they were more, they were actually in a dilemma situation much more than Democrats were. And when we're looking at the now panel C, at the outcome variable, what to do with the account, here again, so the people who chose to suspend the account either temporarily or indefinitely, these are the proportions are of course less than in choices to remove. So then it comes to the account, people are more cautious. They also, the majority of them prefer the sort of this middle way of issuing a warning as opposed to really restricting this account. But still, it also shows that the majority of people prefer taking some action as opposed to doing nothing.
I'm sorry to.
I'm actually almost
okay.
there.
Yeah, so we'll have a few minutes for discussion.
Yeah, so like give me maybe 4 minutes tops. And then again, significant variation between Democrats and Republicans. So as opposed to our previous study where we didn't see that the topic was polarized along partisan line, this one is for sure. And then like the main part of our analysis, of course, because of the conjoint design, is the conjoint analysis, looking at what factors in the scenarios that we presented to people affect their decision to penalize the account or to remove posts the most. And here we're looking at the first outcome variable, choice to remove the posts, right? Like, so what you need to see here is basically on the left, all the attributes that we had in this scenario. And on the right, you see relative to the reference level, what is the impact of each attribute on decision to remove. So for example, when we look at the account, whether it was private citizens or let's say a politician or a celebrity, accounts partisanship, number of followers on this aggregate level had no effect on people's decision to censor. That I think in itself is an interesting finding. It doesn't matter. For people, it didn't matter who it was who shared misinformation for their decision. What mattered, on the other hand, was what kind of topic was shared. Was it climate change as opposed to Holocaust denial? So for instance, if you change in this random scenario generation, if you change the topic from climate change denial to Holocaust denial, the likelihood that people decide to remove the post increases by almost 13 percentage points. And another two attributes that had an impact on people's decision was severity of harms, this deterministic outcome measure that we had. So relatively to no harms, the severe harms, for instance, somebody like really was harmed or killed due to the spreading of misinformation, then of course it also impacted people's decision to remove misinformation from social media accounts, from social media. And this is the second outcome variable, right? The decision to suspend the account, which is here dichotomized from, on the one hand, 0, it's is doing nothing or issuing a warning, and on the other hand, is suspending an account temporarily or indefinitely. And here, one thing stands out is the impact of pattern of behavior. So first time offense versus repeated sharing of misinformation, it has a large effect on people's decision to suspend accounts, which makes total sense, right? Like if you repeatedly share misinformation, it's much more impactful on decision to what to do with the account as opposed to just with the posts. And it's actually also consistent with social media policies that they punish repeated offenders. So yeah, highlights of this study, just very quickly, is that contrary to what maybe some people who are CEOs of certain companies prefer us to think, the majority of respondents, at least in our study, which was conducted in the US, actually prefer limiting spread of harmful misinformation over potentially protecting free speech of people who spread it. That what matters the most for these decisions is how consequential, how harmful this misinformation is, and also if it was a repeated offense, but also the topic of misinformation matters a lot. And then also that I think positive finding is that features related to account itself do not really matter for this decision. So there is some hint at impartiality. It also on the partisan level, for instance, I didn't show this in this slides, but we also didn't see any effect of Democrats punishing Republicans in the scenarios more, and the other way around. And it was just one sentence on this: content moderation of harmful misinformation was a partisan issue, potentially also related to this, to two things. First, that in these particular scenarios, that except for Holocaust denials, Democrats, Republicans were more likely to believe in the underlying content. And the other thing that, of course, there are very different attitudes between Republicans and Democrats to freedom of expression. If Republicans have put in much more value on protecting freedom of expression versus mitigating harms. And that's it from me. We're done? Okay, and we're done.
Thank you, Philipp and Anastasia. We have 9 minutes for questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Also, people who are joining us online, you can let us know if you want. Maybe we can stop sharing the screen and then we can see them. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, Rob.
This is a question or a thought about the content moderation study, Anastasia. And one thing while you were talking that occurred to me is that this could also be a domain in which one thinks more about the veil of ignorance argument by Rawls. And what I mean with that is that what we are doing is that we are presenting you with a scenario. So you already have the content, you have all the consequences. You also know whether it's a more Republican leaning conspiracy, well, it's conspiracy lie, or a more democratic one. So you are already no longer an observer who is creating a regulation that regulation can be applied to everything and anything when you are without you knowing how it will affect you. And the veil of ignorance argument would be that you should create a regulation in a way so that you do not know how it affects you, because you don't even know which opinions you are going to have on this on a particular issue. So in other words, another way of doing this study is not to start out with the content, but actually to start out with a totally abstract situation in which you don't know what your opinions are, what your position in this society is, and so on and so on. And then ask, how would you deal with the problem of misinformation in the digital world? And what kind of content moderation measures would you put into that world? I mean, in the same way as Rawls asked the question with the veil of ignorance, not knowing what your original position is in society, how would you design a society so that it's particularly fair? I mean, with the emphasis on fairness. So we were wondering whether we could also do a veil of ignorance study, at least preceding or even following after, probably preceding, because it would be nice not to prime them with content, but really give them a totally generic abstract situation.
Yeah, that's my only concern with this is that it's a great idea in theory, but in practice, it's very hard for people to actually abstract or separate themselves from their attitudes, like their political views. So if you present them something concrete enough, then these attitudes will just be there. You cannot say then, should you ban Donald Trump from Twitter, right? But please do not think of yourself as a Republican or Democrat at this point. Imagine you are nobody.
But you must not even mention Donald Trump. It's really, I mean, that's not how I would do it.
Yeah. No, I understand.
So what would you say? Here is a politician who lies in some country.
No, I would not even start with that. I would even step further back and say that we are now all familiar with the observation that there's a lot of false information on the internet. And the question is, how can societies respond to that? And so what kind of measures would you, so here's an account that repeatedly spits out false information. Now let's think about which measures would you put in place in order to moderate that account or to respond to that. So basically keeping out all content as much as possible.
Yeah, I think it's possible. Yeah, so the generic content moderation rules, but then also see if these generic preferences hold, then.
And it would still be interesting to see whether Republicans or Democrats are responding differently to this totally neutral, abstract situation.
I think but it's an empirical question, right?
Well, it would be somewhat like the first study you talked about, where we also asked people about their algorithmic preferences without being terribly specific, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we said movies and restaurants and all that, but it wasn't about, the latest blockbuster with the restaurant down the road. It was more generic. So we could do a similar thing.
One concern I have is that it's really hard for people to answer, and it will heavily depend on how they interpret the answering scale and the dilemma. So it will be, because when you say, and it has severe consequences, then everybody thinks about a different kind of consequence. But maybe that's fine. So maybe that's not a.
Maybe part of the veil of ignorance argument.
Yeah. So it will be. We need to make super clear what is a methodological limitation and what is a feature actually.
And I mean, one could emphasize that you need to design it in a way that imagine that it would refer to you, that you would be the person who is affected by the regulation. In fact, you are the person who is affected. Also will be one of the people who is affected by it. How do you want to be affected?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question to better understand this conceptual framework when we talk about harmful. So we have this dilemma of free speech versus harmful attitudes. Free speech seems to be a more universal term that we all might agree, more or less. But regarding harmful information, we also link it to misinformation or disinformation. But it could simply be real information interpreted in the wrong way and generating a chain of reactions and becoming at some point misinformation. So it's like, how do you define what's harmful and what's not? And also because you cannot completely link the initial, let's say, seed of a harmful behavior, right, to the reaction in the community, right? Yeah. And also the cultural dependency, right? Where it's harmful here, it's not in South Africa, let's say.
Okay, two things. One is conceptually related to the definition of the problem, like mis and disinformation kind of thing. There, I would argue we need to actually, the more useful definition, which is used in practice much more, is indeed focusing on distinction between misinformation in general, and then specifically focusing on misinformation which is harmful. In that case, it is defined that can have harmful consequences or pose societal risks. So we're not talking about any kinds of harm, but harms that we are considering relevant on a societal level. Like, for instance, harms to public health or harms to democratic electoral processes, right? Harms to rights of minorities. So the things that are actually also related to other important fundamental rights, or harms to people's privacy. Well, in that case, in the case of misinformation, maybe it's less relevant. And I would still argue that yes, freedom of expression is universal, but avoiding desire to avoid harms is another universal ethical attitudes, which I mean, maybe people who study cross-cultural ethical attitudes would disagree with me, but my intuition, both theoretically and empirically, that this is one thing that we would see in the majority of cultures, that people prefer to avoid harms ethically. I would say it's important to save people from dying. It's important not to kill people. Yeah, and that's also how we design this scenarios, that the most severe deterministic outcome was that somebody actually really suffered from spreading it. They believed in misinformation about vaccination, they got COVID and died. It's extreme, I understand, in that case, but it's important to us experimentally to sort of understand what actually mattered to people then they made this decision. So I would say it is almost as universal, maybe even more so than freedom of expression, because there are countries that freedom of expression doesn't exist, probably. But I would argue that probably on all of these countries, the majority of people has some idea of the principle of harm.
Okay, I'm afraid we ran out of time. Thanks again for Philipp and Anastasia for recording now.